Our planet's climate is a delicate thing. If it's not cared for properly, it will make life much harder for all who call it home. Global awareness of that fact has allowed for some progress to address the causes of climate change. Christiana Figueres, the former head of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, has been at the forefront of that effort for the better part of her more than 40-year career.
Optimistic?
Always.
She took charge of international climate change negotiations after the failed Copenhagen conference of 2009. By 2015, her persistence and hard work helped the world achieve a major breakthrough with the adoption of the Paris Climate Agreement, the first legally binding global treaty to tackle climate change. It was adopted by 196 parties, 195 countries that include the US and China, plus the European Union. The treaty has, for the most part, held strong since, with just one nation withdrawing and then later rejoining the treaty. On this episode of the InnerView, we speak to Christiana Figueres about how the stakes have changed since the signing of that landmark agreement, what more needs to be done, and how we can get there. And Christiana Figueres joins us now on the InnerView. Ma'am, it's a pleasure having you on the program. Welcome.
Imran, thank you so much for the invitation, and it's good to see you again.
Yes, we last chatted 14 years ago. I was working for another network. And you know what's interesting about it is that maybe it's an interesting opportunity to remind ourselves of just how quickly 14 years can fly. That was 2010. And to maybe look forward. 14 years from now, if there isn't dramatic change to the way we behave, the way our governments behave, the way we emit fossil fuels, what will this world look like in the year 2038?
Oh, well, let's start with a difficult question, right? Imran, it is such a stark contrast, the world that we will be in 2038, depending on what we do over the next few years. And the way I think about it as two very, very different paths. If we take a path of not controlling our greenhouse gas emissions the way we ought to, such that we will be at approximately half of what we have now by 2030, not by 2038, but by 2030, then we have baked in a global heating factor that is going to have devastating effects on agriculture, on populations that live on coastlines because of sea level rise and intrusion of sea water, on vast areas of the world that will be not just in drought, but too hot to, in fact, even inhabit. Now, if we actually do our job, and if we're able to cut our emissions by half by 2030, then the astonishing thing is by 2038, we will already be opening a portal to a world that is much better than the world we have now. So it's not just about avoiding the worst. It's about laying the basis for a much better world with much better global health, with much more stability in our agricultural systems, with cities that are livable, with less migration because people would be forced otherwise to leave their homes. So we are looking at two very, very different worlds, depending on what we do in the short term.
You mentioned migration, and I think one of the big differences between 2015, when the Paris Climate Agreement happened, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that and how you were instrumental in making that happen. I think one of the big differences from the outside looking in has been that people are more able to see the interconnectedness between climate change and migration, climate change and conflict. So these aren't seen as separate things. The global migration crisis, the war in Gaza, the war in Ukraine, Sudan, and so on and so forth. At the very least, is that a positive thing that people, well, mostly get it? Yes, there's climate denial, but people mostly get what we're dealing with and what the ramifications are.
Yes, of course. We shouldn't say that all migration actually is because of climate change. There are some, for example, in war zones that produce migration that is not climate related. But we already do have very clear evidences of climate related migration, and that is not forced. That is actually voluntary, Imran. And that is so sad because these people just decide they have to leave their ancestors' home where they have lived for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and they have to go somewhere else in order to protect their livelihood and in order to be able to raise their children and future generations. That is just terribly, terribly sad. Now, as you say, we are fortunately beginning to understand that climate affects everything, that it is a completely transversal factor in our life, that it affects, obviously, where we live, how we live, what our health is, what our transport is, how we produce energy. It is so transversal that sometimes it's difficult to see it because it's ever present, omnipresent everywhere. But I think that complexity of climate change and the fact that it is affecting every human endeavor and every sector of human activity, we're beginning to understand that. And we're beginning to understand that we are both at the most difficult and challenging moment in human history, but also one of the most promising because of what is possible if we address climate change.
Do we underestimate how much of a success the Paris Agreement was in 2015 and what it took to get to that?
Well, I don't know if we underestimate. I think there's wide recognition that it was a historic achievement to get all the countries in the world to agree to a legally binding pathway for decarbonizing the global economy over the next few decades. That was an amazing achievement. Now, the question is, are we actually executing it? Because like any brilliant strategic plan, let's call it, or a business plan, if you will, if it's just taken and put on a shelf, it doesn't really have the effect that it was intended. So now it's about taking the Paris Agreement and being able to achieve the milestones that are baked into the Paris achievement. And there we are behind schedule.
Okay, well, let me approach it from a slightly different direction. At that time, COP15, if I'm not mistaken, had sort of failed. It fell apart. Now we're at, what, COP29 coming up? There's a lot of COPs to keep up with. So that had failed. There didn't seem to be the political will. Tell me how challenging it was, with you being, as you would call yourself, a stubborn optimist, how challenging it was to herd all these big cats together to get everybody on the same page. Let's disregard what came after it for the moment. Tell me about that challenge at that time in 2015.
Well, that was a huge challenge because let's remember that that journey started in 2009, the year in which the United Nations had what I call its most successful failure, which was the failure of the Copenhagen conference in 2009. That was the first time that the world intended to come to a global agreement on climate, and that failed miserably. And so coming out of that Copenhagen conference in December of 2009, I must say, and I was there also, I consider myself a Copenhagen survivor, as do thousands of other people. And coming out of that conference, the global mood on climate was in the trash can. Nobody wanted to talk to each other. Governments didn't want to talk to each other. Governments didn't want to talk to private sector. Private sector didn't want to talk to governments. Nobody wanted to talk to each other. Everyone was furious with the Secretariat. Everyone was furious with the United Nations. There was just such a gloomy and destructive, self-destructive mood on climate change. So that was the lovely condition in which I stepped into the leadership of the international climate change negotiations. And honestly, that was not something that could be healed overnight. That took several years of healing to first build up again the 500 people who work at the Secretariat and give their life to this, who were so despondent and so miserable. So first, build up the team, then talk to every single government and understand where, yes, their pain, but also their vision. Where do they want to go? What is sustainable development for them in their near and mid future? And then to begin to weave all of those interests and all of those visions of 195 countries, weave it in to a legally binding text that provides the guardrails for a decarbonized economy, as I said, over the next few decades. So not an easy task, but one that I was very honored to assume.
And after that, to what extent did the Trump administration hurt your efforts, derail some of your efforts?
Yes, Imran. So I remember when Trump won, and he announced that he was going to pull the United States out of the Paris Agreement, and it was announced at which speech in the Rose Garden he was going to announce this. So I was on travel, and I remember that I sat in front of the television and thought, I'm going to watch this speech from beginning to end. And I'm going to put down every time that there is a phrase that is accurate and scientifically true. I watched the whole speech, and at the end of the speech, Imran, I had a completely blank piece of paper. He had been so ill-advised. He had so misunderstood the structure, and he based his exit, or the exit of the United States from the Paris Agreement, on all of this misinformation and misinterpretation. So that was an interesting, but I would say, as we know now, a rather typical case for Mr. Trump. What was very interesting after that is that he predicted that many other countries would also leave. Not a single other country left. He also predicted that the United States would not continue its decarbonization efforts. Nothing farther from the truth. There were states, there were cities, there were corporations who understand that decarbonizing the economy is the path of the future. And that despite what happened in the White House, and despite that by executive order he pulled the United States out, they continued to decarbonize in order to protect their competitiveness. And we know the end of that story. As soon as we had a new administration on the first day, the United States was back in the Paris Agreement.
We're still addicted to fossil fuels, though, and decarbonization has not happened to the extent that you want it to happen. Tell me what's missing. Is the challenge a technical one? Is it a financial one, or is it a moral one?
It's not a technical one. The fact is that the technologies that are the solutions to climate change, all of the renewable energy sources that we have, wind and solar in particular, have actually improved in their efficiency and their performance and decreased in their cost by about 80% since 2010. So they are today much more competitive than the incumbent fuels of coal, gas, and any of the other fossil fuels. So it's not a technical issue. It is also not a financial issue. Last year, there were $1 billion that went into fossil fuel new generation capacity, but 1.7 billion, almost twice as much, that went into renewable energy, new renewable energy generation. So the financial world has realized where the future lies and is investing, and everything points to the possibility of this year also renewable energy, new generation of renewable energy, actually attracting much more investment than the incumbents. So it's not technology, it's not finance. It is the fact that the incumbent industries, the fossil fuel, the oil and gas, more than the coal, but the fossil fuel companies have actually bought the political space. They have convinced some political leaders, luckily not President Biden, but they have convinced some political leaders that we cannot do without fossil fuels. It is completely a myth, as is being demonstrated in many developing countries that are swiftly moving from fossil fuels to renewables. But the stranglehold of the fossil fuel companies is basically what is here holding us back from the advance and the progress that not only that we could have, but that we should have.
Some of us who are of the older generations sometimes buy that, or often buy that the alternative is you impoverish yourself if you have to change your lifestyle, right? But the younger generation doesn't seem to be buying that. The Greta Thunbergs and the Vanessa Nakates and other young people don't buy this false dichotomy. How do you feel when you see these young people taking a stand and saying that we have cursed not only their generation, but we're wrecking the future of humanity unless we change our ways?
Well, they're absolutely right. They're absolutely right. Now that we have reached and breached planetary boundaries on so many different accounts, there is no other option but to protect the context, the natural context, nature, the resources that are on this planet, to protect them so that they can support us, so that we can not just survive, but thrive over generations. Entirely possible, but only if we bring these two concepts together. How do we strengthen our economy while at the same time, or in fact, through protecting the natural resources that were given to us?
You mentioned developing countries that are doing very well, and I put a pin in that in my mind, and I want to circle back to that. Who's doing it well? Give me some examples.
You know, Chile is doing it very well. Kenya is doing it very well. Vietnam is doing it very well. There are countries that you think, well, Costa Rica, my own country, of course, but some countries that perhaps are a surprise, but that have realized that they cannot continue to sell their energy security to other states who are the fossil fuel exporters. They cannot continue to sell their energy stability, which is equivalent to economic stability, to other states that are unpredictable. And we saw this, of course, the best example of that is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the fact that Russia then weaponized its exports of oil and gas. Who wants to be in the hands of a state like the Putin-led Russia that is completely unpredictable and is capable of weaponizing energy, which is exactly what is at the basis of our development? So that is why developing countries are beginning to invest into their renewable sources, which by and large tend to be national sources, not just natural sources of energy, but national sources. Hence, they have much more control.
I'm glad you mentioned your country, Costa Rica. The daughter of the president, your brother was the president as well, your mom a diplomat as well, and I see she's in her 90s now, bless her, she's going strong. Tell me how much that upbringing in Costa Rica, with Costa Rica being what it is, but also your family situation being what it is, tell me how much that shaped you, shaped your drive, your desire, and your commitment to what you do.
You know, I've been thinking about that. It's interesting that you asked me that today, Imran, because I've been thinking about that. I've been thinking a lot about my father, who was 3 times president of Costa Rica and who reestablished democracy in a country in which democracy was under threat. And he did it through an armed revolution. And then he disbanded his own revolutionary army and the army of the country, the national army, in order to protect the peace and the stability. And he took the budget of the army and he put it into the Ministry of Education and into nature protection. And I've been thinking how interesting that my father was always led by the North Star of social justice in our country, and how I have consciously or unconsciously inherited the same North Star of social justice, but not only in my country, on our planet. Because it is very evident that climate change, unaddressed climate change, is the biggest injustice that humanity has ever seen. It is unjust of the North against the South. It is unjust of us oldies against the youngies. It is unjust of the haves against the have-nots. It is unjust, frankly, of the male gender against the female gender and children. And you can go down the line and itemize how many injustices are embedded into the unaddressed climate issue that we are facing. So social justice has always been my flag, and I'm beginning to recognize, maybe I inherited that.
That's beautiful. Tell us about your recurring nightmare.
Yes, speak about injustice. I have had for a long time, and actually not recently, but as I was preparing for the Paris Agreement, I had a recurring dream that, depending on the answer, could be a dream or could be a nightmare. And the dream was that I saw 7 pairs of black eyes, and I don't know why they were black, but 7 pairs of black eyes that I then over time interpreted as representing 7 generations down the line after me. And these 7 pairs of black eyes asked me one question constantly: what did you do? And the answer to that question determines the quality of life of those 7 generations. If we do what we have to do, we actually open the possibility for a future that is so much better for future generations. But if we don't, if the answer to that question is, well, I kind of did something, but we didn't really face up to it, then we have condemned those 7 generations. So that is a question, Imran, that I dreamt recurrently, but it's a question for all of us. It is the question that we should all wake up with in the morning. What did you do?
And if you had to give a one-line answer to that question, what did you do?
My one-line answer is, I met the targets that science imposes on us.
Do we respect the science globally? I know there are people who still question the science. I know there are a lot of studies that are funded by the fossil fuel industry to muddy the waters a little bit, create doubt. But overall, do we respect the science?
Well, Imran, it's a very good question. Why? Why do we not respect the science the way that we should? I think most people understand that there is gravity, that gravity is a pulling force on this planet. And how many people question gravity? How many people today, I mean, I know there are some flat earthers, but hopefully not too many. How many people today question the fact that we live on a round planet and that we circle around the sun? I mean, there are some basic facts of science that it just makes no sense to question. And yet, there is a convenience in questioning the science of climate change. That is terrifying.
And that convenience conveniently means that you don't have to change anything and continue to make a buck out of fossil fuels.
Exactly. Exactly. And the fossil fuel companies have raked in historic profits over the past few years, certainly since the Russian invasion in Ukraine. The fossil fuel companies have been raking in historic profits. Who pays the price? There is no profit that doesn't have a price paid by someone. That profit is being paid today, but also will be paid by future generations, by people who have no responsibility in having caused climate change and who are the most affected by climate change.
My final question to you, I'm hoping that this interview will be a sort of archive hundreds of years from now. It will be, YouTube will be a sort of library, no matter what it's called. Hundreds of years from now, our distant descendants might watch this. What would your message to them be?
My message to people 100 years from now. Well, you know, Imran, that I am a stubborn optimist. So my message is going to be an optimistic message. And I would say, watch. Watch how at the beginning of the 21st century, we turned the page of history in a way that we had never done before.
That's great. And if they're watching, it probably means we haven't destroyed our civilization by that time. Christiana Figueres, I thank you so much for joining us on the InnerView. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Good to see you again.
Take care. Bye-bye.